Many people don't know that the 2026 DCU Supergirl movie is not the first time Supergirl got her own standalone movie. Back in 1984, DC already tried this once, and this is one of those movies that is very easy to dismiss. It didn't become a major franchise starter. It didn't make a huge impact at the box office, and for some viewers, it is mostly remembered as an odd side chapter in the Christopher Reeve Superman era. But we are not here to just discuss whether this movie was great or not, but we are here to discuss what this movie was trying to understand about Kara Zor-El. Because before Supergirl became this more wounded cosmic figure in the 2026 movie, Helen Slater's Supergirl gave us a very different version of strength. Softer, more sincere, more vulnerable. And maybe this is exactly why she's still worth talking about. So by the end of this video, I want to figure out three things. Why Supergirl 1984 failed, why it still gets right about Kara, and why this version of Supergirl still matters today. To understand that, we have to go back to the moment this movie came from. In 1984, superhero movies were not what they are now. Today, we are used to cinematic universes, shared timelines, fan theories, box office tracking, and every comic book movie being treated like part of a bigger machine. But when Supergirl came out, that world did not exist yet. This movie came from the Christopher Reeve Superman era, and that matters because those movies had a very specific identity. They were sincere, they were romantic, they were mythic. They were not embarrassed by the idea of a hero who was good simply because being good mattered. So when Supergirl got her own movie, it tried to extend that same kind of wonder to Kara, and on paper that made sense. Superman had already proven that audiences could believe a person could fly, so the next question was, could they believe in her, his cousin? Could Supergirl carry that same sense of fantasy, hope, and adventure without feeling like a copy of Superman? That was the early roadblock that movie was facing. Because Kara was connected to Superman, but she could not be Superman again. If the movie made her too similar, she would feel unnecessary. But if it moved too far away from him, audiences might wonder what made this part of the same world, and that tension explained why Supergirl 1984 feels so unusual. The movie tried to be a Superman spin-off, a coming-of-age story, a fantasy adventure, a school movie, a romance, and a magical villain story all at the same time. That mixture did not always work. But underneath those strange choices, the movie was trying to answer a real question. What does a Supergirl movie look like when Supergirl is allowed to be softer, younger, more curious, and more emotionally open than Superman? And that is where Helen Slater's version of Kara becomes important. Because if there is one thing in this movie that still works better than people give it credit for, I think it's her. Helen Slater does not come across like a female version of Christopher Reeve. She does not have that same polished confidence and charm, and I actually think that was the right choice. Her Kara feels younger, more open, more unsure of herself, powerful, and yet still learning what that power means. There is a softness to her performance that I think it's easy to misread as weakness, especially through a modern lens that sometimes confuses strength with hardness. But I don't think it is weakness. I think that is the point. This version of Kara is not strong because she is emotionally untouchable. She is strong because she is still willing to care. She still looks at the world with curiosity. She still feels things openly. She is not trying to hide every vulnerable part of herself just to prove she belongs in the same conversation as Superman. And that matters because Supergirl deserves to be her own hero outside the shadow of Superman. Unlike Superman, Kara feels like someone discovering her purpose in real time. She is new to Earth, she is still figuring out people, danger, emotion, identity, and responsibility. She's not just learning how to use her power, she is learning what kind of person she wants to be with that power. That is where the movie had the right instinct. Kara does not need to be made colder to be taken seriously. She does not need to be more aggressive to be powerful. She does not need to lose her innocence for the story to prove she has depth. A woman can be strong and still be gentle. She can be brave and still be unsure. The movie around her, however, does not always know what to do with that idea. Even when the story gets messy, even when the tone shifts, even when the villain plot starts to take over, Helen Slater's performance keeps bringing it back to one simple thing. This Kara wants to do good, not because she wants power or attention, but because helping people feels natural to her, and to me, that is one of the most important part of Supergirl. But a good instinct is not the same thing as a fully working movie. And that is where Supergirl 1984 starts to struggle. The problem was not that Kara was too soft, too innocent, or too emotionally open. If anything, those are the parts of the movie that still gives it some life. The problem was that the story around her did not always know how to support that version of the character. The movie begins with a very comic book idea. Kara lives in Argo City, a hidden Kryptonian society that survived after the destruction of Krypton. Then an important power source called the Omega Hedron is lost and Kara goes to Earth to retrieve it. That setup should have been enough. Kara leaves her home, she discovers Earth, she has to find the object that can save her people, and along the way she has to become Supergirl. That is a clean story, but instead, the movie starts adding a lot of different pieces. We get the school setting, we get the secret identity, we get the romance with Ethan, we get Selena and her magic, we get this strange battle between Kryptonian science and supernatural fantasy, and eventually, the movie starts feeling like several different movies fighting for space. Some of those pieces are interesting on their own. The school setting makes sense because Kara is young and still learning how to exist on Earth. The secret identity gives her a normal life to hide inside. Even the fantasy element could have worked. But the problem is focus. The movie keeps pulling attention away from Kara's inner journey. Instead of building everything around her growth, the story often drifts into Selena's obsession with power, the romance subplot, or the strange rules of the Omega Hedron, and that matters because Kara is the most interesting part of the movie. When the film stays with her, it has something. When it lets us watch her discover Earth, understand kindness, experience danger, and slowly step into the role of a hero, the movie feels like it knows what it wants to be. But when the story moves away from that, the emotional center becomes weaker. That is why the movie can feel so uneven. It has wonder, but not always momentum. It has charm, but not always urgency. It has a strong idea for Kara, but not a strong enough story to carry her. Supergirl 1984 often treated Kara's journey to Earth like just another part of the movie, instead of the thing the whole movie should have been built around. It had a version of Kara worth following, it just did not always give her the movie she deserved. And unfortunately, audiences and critics were not especially kind to the movie. Supergirl opened in 1984 and the numbers were not exactly what you would want from a movie connected to the Superman franchise. It made around $14 million at the domestic box office, which might sound like a decent number at first, until you remember that the movie reportedly cost around $35 million to make. So this was not just a movie that underperformed, it was a movie that pretty much killed the idea of Supergirl becoming her own theatrical franchise at that time, and the reviews were not much kinder. The general reaction was clear. The movie was seen as uneven, too slow, too scattered, and not strong enough to stand beside the Superman films it came from. And honestly, I understand why. When a studio makes the first standalone Supergirl movie, it cannot just rely on the fact that people already know Superman. You have to prove why Kara deserves her own story. It had Helen Slater, it had the costume, it had the connection to the Superman universe, it had the fantasy, it had some charm. But it did not have a story sharp enough to make audiences walk away feeling like Supergirl had fully arrived. So instead of becoming the beginning of a long movie franchise, Supergirl 1984 became a footnote, a strange side chapter, the movie people brings up when they talk about failed superhero spin-offs. But I think that is also why it is worth revisiting. Once a film gets labeled as a failure, people stop asking what it was actually trying to do. They stop separating the bad choices from the interesting ones. And with Supergirl 1984, I think that happened. The movie failed, but Helen Slater's Kara did not deserve to be reduced to that failure. Because even if the movie did not give Supergirl the franchise she needed, it still gave us a version of the character that understood something important. Kara does not have to be Superman, and she does not have to be a hardened, emotionally closed-off hero either. That is why the legacy of this movie is more complicated than just saying it was bad so people forgot it, because whether it worked or not, it became the first real attempt to answer a question DC is still asking now. What should a Supergirl movie actually be? And that brings us to the 2026 Supergirl movie. Now that this version is here, the comparison is more interesting than I expected. At first, it looked like these two movies were complete opposites. Supergirl 1984 came from the Christopher Reeve era. It was sincere, fantasy-driven, innocent, and built around a softer version of Kara. Supergirl 2026 comes from a very different superhero world. This is a version of Kara shaped by trauma, loss, anger, cosmic violence, and a more rebellious personality. One version looks at Earth with wonder, the other looks at the universe like it has already hurt her. And on the surface, that sounds like a massive difference, but the more interesting similarity is that both movies seem to be facing the same problem. In both cases, people can look at the actress and say, there is something here. With Helen Slater, there was a gentleness and sincerity that made Kara feel different from Superman. With Millie Alcock, from what many early reactions seem to agree on, there is a stronger, rougher, more wounded presence that makes Kara feels different from Superman in another way. But in both cases, the question becomes, did the movie around her fully support that version of Kara? The 1984 movie had a Kara worth following, but the story around her became too scattered. The 2026 movie, at least based on the early reaction, seemed to be facing a similar criticism from a different direction. People may like the idea of this rougher, more damaged Supergirl, they may like the performance, but some are still asking whether the movie itself gave her the story she deserved, and I think that says something important. Supergirl is not easy to adapt. If you make her too close to Superman, she feels unnecessary. If you make her too different, you risk losing the emotional clarity that makes the super family work in the first place. If you make her too innocent, people may call her weak. If you make her too hardened, people may feel like she has been flattened into a familiar modern action hero. And somewhere in the middle of all of this is Kara Zor-El. She should be allowed to be powerful without becoming emotionally closed off. She should be allowed to carry pain without being defined only by pain. She should be allowed to be different from Superman without the movie forgetting that hope is still part of her DNA. That is why I do not think the real comparison between 1984 and 2026 is about which movie is better. It is about what each era thinks Supergirl has to become in order to be taken seriously. In 1984, the answer was wonder, innocence, fantasy, and sincerity. In 2026, the answer seems to be trauma, anger, rebellion, and a much rougher emotional edge. Maybe both answers reveal something true about Kara, but both answers also risk becoming incomplete if the movie forgets the balance. The best version of Kara is probably somewhere between those two ideas: strong but not hardened, vulnerable but not helpless, wounded but not empty, hopeful but not naive. And that is why Supergirl 1984 still matters, not because it solved the character, but because even through all its flaws, it understood that Kara's strength did not have to look exactly like Superman's. So where does that leave Supergirl's 1984? It has real problems. The story is scattered, the pacing can drag, the villain plot takes up too much space, and for a movie that should have been about Kara fully stepping into her own identity, it sometimes feels strangely distracted from her. But I also do not think this is a movie that should be dismissed as just a failed spin-off, because there is something valuable buried inside it. It understood that Supergirl did not need to become Superman to matter. That sounds simple, but it is one of the hardest things about this character. Kara is always going to exist near Superman. She carries the same symbol, she comes from the same lost world, she has similar powers, she belongs to the same myth. But if she is only written as a younger female version of him, then she loses the thing that makes her interesting. And I think the 1984 movie, for all its flaws, understood one side of that balance. It understood that Kara could be gentle, unsure, and emotionally open without being weak. It understood that her strength did not have to come from being colder, harder, or more aggressive than everyone around her. That is why Helen Slater's version still stands out. Her Kara had sincerity. She wanted to help because helping felt right. She cared because caring was part of who she was. She did not have to hide that softness to prove she was powerful. And maybe that is the part of Supergirl 1984 that deserves to survive its reputation, because strength does not always have to look like emotional distance, sarcasm, anger, revenge, or physical dominance. Sometimes strength is being vulnerable and still choosing to act. Sometimes strength is being afraid and still choosing to care. Sometimes strength is having the power to destroy but still being moved by the simple need to save. And for me, that is where Supergirl 1984 still has value. It failed as the beginning of a franchise, but it did not fail at giving us a Kara who felt distinct. A Kara who was not Superman, a Kara whose power still had softness inside it. And maybe that is why, all these years later, it is worth going back to the first Supergirl movie, not to pretend it was better than it was, but to remember that sometimes a flawed movie can still understand something important about a character. Supergirl 1984 did not give Kara the movie she deserved, but it did give us a version of Kara worth remembering. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like. It helps the channel and tells YouTube to recommend it to more people who might enjoy this kind of movie analysis. Subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications so you don't miss the next video. And thank you for watching.